Everyone, welcome back to my channel, Bob's Garage. I'm in the trailer. I keep the Jeepster for the wintertime. So this one I've done previous videos on. If you've seen them, if you haven't, take a look. But I've been having a little bit of a rough idle problem with the engine in this car, which is a Buick V6 engine, a 225. And I've been working on a bunch of different things, trying to return some of the carburation back to original, making changes to timing, a bunch of things. But this year decided I'm going to go right back to the basics because I didn't get it any better. I got it so when it's cold, it runs really well, but as it gets hotter, it starts getting really rough. When I had a manual choke on it and I put the manual choke on, there was a good improvement. If I plug the PCV valve, it improved a lot to the point where it got so rich that it would make your eyes water. But it made a lot of difference. So I smelt on occasion like an antifreeze. It doesn't go down much though. It only goes down like a quarter cup or so every 2 months maybe. But I started putting a few things together anyways. I've been putting this off because I've got in the back of my mind what I think the problem might be, and I'm kind of dreading it. To give you a bit of a background, this has always been this way. I found that the cam lobes had all worn off. So pulled the heads off, put new cam in it, had new hardened seats put in. The heads seem fine. So I'm going to dig into, like I say, go right back to the very beginning. I don't know if we can see everything here. Turn the light on. So I decided to start at the very basic. So car's all, like I said, hasn't been run yet. I pulled out the spark plugs. So this is kind of interesting. So number 1, 3, and 5. So let's see if we can see those. 1 looks perfect. 3 has got a bit of a tan color, but the electrode is white. Then 5, perfect. Yeah, this one maybe, number 1 maybe a little bit lighter, but that white electrode on number 3. Now you go over here and things started looking again kind of strange. A white electrode, very white porcelain. Number 4, a white electrode, porcelain, slightly tan. And then on number 6, a white electrode. So it's kind of suggesting, so I got the spark plugs out. So I'm going to go through some of the obvious. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a pressure test. White electrodes, so a couple here, like I said, 1 there. It's a possibility that it's lean. Now that makes sense. When I had the car running and I plugged the PCV, like I said, your eyes hurt. And when it started to run poor, when I had the manual choke, pulling the choke on, it's an automatic one now, but putting it on actually improved it. So it feels like a vapor lock, but if it's running really lean, of course, pretty much the same thing. It's starving for fuel. So I'm leaning towards 2 potential solutions here. Get the light off. It is running really lean. I don't know why. I've played in the previous one also with PCV, wondering if there was something wrong. I had 2 of them changing, no difference. Actually put a restrictor in and that kind of improved a little bit. That's not the way it's supposed to be. But that seems to imply, PVC not working proper or excessive airflow. So the PCV is mixing crankcase air with the carburetor. So too much air, you're effectively leaning things out. So a possibility. Now that's changing as it gets hotter. So what would change with the engine? Don't know. But that was strange. The white could be coolant. So I'm going to start with the easy stuff first. So I've got my pressure testing kit for the radiator. So I'm going to hook that up, pressure test the radiator to 13 pounds, and I'm going to see if it holds. So I'm going to bring it back when I've done that. We're going to pump it up to the 13 pounds and see what happens. Got that at pretty much exactly 13 psi. Going to leave that for 20 minutes and see how that goes. Said 20 to 30 minutes and see how much you get. In the meantime, I'm going to put Boroscope down into the bore of the cylinders and see if I can see any indication of any moisture. One other thing that leads me to think there's a problem with the white electrode being coolant is, as I said, I smelled a little bit of coolant. That could have been coolant leaking from the head onto the exhaust manifold, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything. I've noticed sometimes in the cooler weather, more white smoke coming from. I don't see it when it's warm, just when it's a damp day. So it, again, doesn't tell you anything, but I'm going to try that as well. Okay, so went through 3 cylinder bores. I saw a white exhaust valve, so I thought, oh, well, maybe that's the sign of water again. But all the exhaust valves are white. So, and sometimes you see, if you got a leaking head gasket, you can see the steam blasting around the gasket. You'll see like a washing away of the carbon. Didn't see any of that. So the bores, the cylinders all look pretty consistent between what appears to be really good on the best cylinder, meaning from looking at the spark plugs, to what looks like the whitest electrode, leanest or water leaking in, and I can't see any different there either. So a little perplexed, no lines. I was able on the number 6 cylinder, where it's the worst looking one in terms of the spark plug, go all the way around. I'll put the video in there. I'll probably just narrate the video to the actual Boroscope movie as well. No indications of any moisture. No, I could see the combustion chamber pretty clearly. The Boroscope I'm using's got 2 cameras, so I can look backwards, so pretty easy to see. No indications of any carbon being washed away. No indications of corrosion, and looking at, it's probably been 10-15 minutes now. No change in pressure from the radiator. I'm going to leave it on a bit longer, just to make sure. I'll probably come on and put away some tools and check it again. But if there's a leak, it's not dropping fast. So I'm going to do next is I'm going to work on a compression test on all the cylinders. So again, something I probably should have done before. Crank it over a few times with the throttle wide open. I didn't want to do anything until I got the Boroscope down and took a look. But go around and take a look to see all the cylinders, they're all getting equal pressure. Not as likely an issue here because, as I said, it's not showing, head gasket bone is going to show up as a low pressure. That's going to be rings, and that's going to be valve seats. So nothing really leading me to think there's any problem that way, but I'll rule it out. I got all the spark plugs out anyways, and I'll get that information as well. But right now, unless that pressure gauge goes down on the radiator cap, it's kind of looking like it's lean. Now, history of that is I had a Holley 2-barrel, and the passenger side, I couldn't get any kind of adjustment in the oil mixture, going back and forth. That one I had to have the choke partially on all the time. So again, a lean condition. And then I put the new carburetor on, rebuilt, and it was better. but still similar. Now, I'm not 100% confident in that. When I got it, it was a used one. One of the mixture screws had been driven all the way in. I'm going to swap that out. But got me thinking. This car didn't have a booster originally. It would have been a manual brake because it's drums all the way around. And at least I think so. All the vacuum booster has all been replaced. It looks like it's a kit. Don't typically see power brakes on these. I'm going to do a little bit of reading on that, but I think it's an aftermarket. So vacuum from the booster and PCV both join in the back. That's not original. At least I don't think it is. And I'm having a real hard time finding what it's supposed to look like. So I'm going to, and I've tried this before, but I'm going to try it again. I'm going to block off the booster, just thinking maybe the diaphragm's gotten, the brakes feel fine, but largely since I've changed the master cylinder out to the proper size, but maybe there's a problem in the vacuum. So I'm going to take that off. Later, what I'll also do is I'll get a vacuum gauge on the intake. I think I did that before. I think it was roughly normal, but maybe a little bit low. But I'm going to try to eliminate vacuum sources. The fact that you have to, when the car gets hot, you have to, it starts having these problems, and you have to put on a lot of choke. Or when you close the PCV, you get better performance. That could mean also a a vacuum leak in the intake manifold. That's definitely a possibility. I spent a great deal of time. It's not likely the heads, because they were done. That hasn't changed. Block's the same and intake's the same. If there's a vacuum leak, that's a possibility. It's just strange that we're seeing it on number 3 and number 2. Whoops. Number 3 and number 2 and number 4, number 6, maybe even a little bit on number 2. So you would think if you had a vacuum leak, it would have been 1 or 2 of the runners. But I do remember struggling a little bit trying to make sure it's perfectly square. So I'm going to go look at that as well. Well, I went through the compression check. I probably should have put it on film, but I don't know, you've probably seen it 1,000 times. Nothing surprising. Actually, it was first side. I did the passenger side first, and it was turned out to be too perfect that I thought nobody believed me, and I thought I better film this. This side, though, back cylinder was about 135. Yeah, 135. Two fronts. Whoops. Two fronts were 120. And then we had 160, 160, and then 170. So 160, 160, whoops, sorry. 160, 160, 170, and then 130, 130, and 135. Can't really explain that, but again, that doesn't match anything with what's happening. No real pattern. I'm not really sure why one side's a little higher than the other. That's another mystery for another day. It might just be the amount of how well the valves are sealing or something. Don't know. So anyways, nothing there. There's no real bad cylinder, but again, lack of compression makes no sense for these. They're getting reasonable. It's too far though. 130 to 170 is more than 10%, so it's not good. But again, I don't think that's the reason why we're having problems with this. And thought I'd bring you back. So it's been a half hour now. Sorry for the loud noises. It's been a half hour, and I don't know if you can read that or not, but that pressure is is still 13, just a tad under 13 for half an hour. So that really doesn't seem like that's the issue. Maybe there's a slow leak, but that's not the issue. So we've got, I think I'm leaning towards some form of a vacuum leak. So I'm going to take a look at the carburetor. Like I said, I rebuilt this one. I don't think that's the issue. I'm going to look at the vacuum lines again, specifically the PCV and the booster, and see if it's an issue. I'm going to try swapping out the other Rochester tuber. I bought one online that was already rebuilt. Never tried it because I rebuilt my own. And frankly, that's a long story. Got caught up for a couple of years. But I don't think it's the carburetor per se, because this was doing this when I had the Holly on it, doing pretty much the exact same thing with the Rochester, the original Rochester. It is a bit better now. The Holly, I think, was just too large for this car. But anyways, I don't think that's the issue. I'm leaning towards because I'm seeing lean cylinders on both sides, what it looks to be lean. I'm not losing coolant and I'm not losing pressure. I'm leaning towards some form of a vacuum leak, either hoses or the intake itself. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything, put everything apart. I'm going to get all my tools put away. I'm going to move in out of this cramped little enclosed car trailer, get the car into a garage so I can get a bit more space, get closer to my tools, and we can start working on taking a few things apart and do a little bit closer inspection, a few more tests. So I think I might have mentioned earlier in this video that the vacuum was fine. I decided to go and check a bunch of things. Since I found something completely surprising, meaning that multiple spark plugs and the exhaust valves were all showing signs of being lean. Exhaust valves on several of the cylinders are white. When I put the Boroscope down and saw spark plugs were lean, I figured maybe I better double check the vacuum reading. Well, sure enough, I had the vacuum gauge, and I don't know what I did with it now. I had the vacuum gauge. I took it inside to calibrate it, but I had it hooked up, and I'm only reading about 13 inches of vacuum. So what I did, what you can use a vacuum gauge to do for testing is you can help diagnose the motor. So what I've read and what the gauge actually says is that if you're in like the 10 inches of vacuum, then that's late timing, like a tooth has skipped in the timing gear. Now I put a new cam in that, and I put in new timing chain and gears, but maybe I didn't line it up properly. It's a pretty easy thing to do, done without lots of times. Maybe a vacuum leak. Well, that's certainly a possibility. I've had the top of the motor apart, and maybe it got some problem. So I did squirt. Won't do it now with the engine running, but I squirted brake clean, so it's just flammable, around the base of the intake manifold and the base of the carburetor. Well, no change. It had no impact. So what you're looking for when you do that is if there's a vacuum leak, it's going to suck that combustible material in and the motor's going to race. Well, that never happened. So the next thing I got to do is how do you distinguish between late timing versus a vacuum leak? Certainly not leaking out of the motor. Well, if it's leaking internal to the motor, like basically the bottom of the vacuum of the intake manifold gaskets, it's going to actually suck air from within the motor. So what you can do for that, turn this back around, is to diagnose that, you pull off the PCV valve and you pull off the breather. You plug the breather, you hook up a pressure gauge onto the crankcase, and a normal motor is going to have blow-by gases from the combustion, and it's going to get into the crankcase. And that's going to slowly build up internal pressure in the motor. So the PCV valve takes those exhaust gases and recirculates them back into the motor, burns them off. Well, if you're producing, if it's pulling, the intake's leaking from the crankcase, you'll never build up pressure. So that absence of pressurization in the crankcase is indication of a vacuum leak. So I'm going to test that next. Not sure how well you can hear this. I've got pressure gauge hooked up to the valve cover over there, just using a PCV valve, but it's free flowing out, so that won't prevent anything. I put my hand over top the breather cover. I've been revving the motor. Let me try to do this again, just 1 second. Trying to do this for a while here now. So I'm revving the motor up, and there's no apparent change. Now it could be that it's just because the motor's not warmed up, not leaking, or it could be that the vacuum leak is equal to blow-by. Don't know if it's a problem if that's the case, but there's no change. And when I remove my hand, you can't feel anything there. Now if I put something over top, yeah, you can't really see. The fan, of course, is going to be pushing a lot of air, but there's really no blow-by here to speak of. Nor is there any vacuum. So that's strange. Guess that doesn't really tell anything, although it's whatever the problem is, not very excessive. So again, that's a bit of a surprise. So I'll just hook this back up so you can see this. Hook the PCV valve back up. I'm going to leave the breather open and hook my pressure gauge on. Got more vacuum hoses on here now than I know what to do with. But just 1 second. Now the one thing I didn't do is there is one, I'll turn the light on, at the back of the motor there's about a 1/4 inch tube that goes back to the transmission. So I'll test that next, but I want to show you what I'm seeing. Set the pressure gauge right here so you can see it. At least I think you can see it. And I'll start the motor up again. So that's it, it's around 11 degrees. So 11 degrees is somewhere between late timing, ignition timing, to a late valve timing or a vacuum leak. So it's gone up a bit higher now, it's 12, but still way too low, just barely below. So again, that's strange. So I'm leaning towards timing, valve timing, that is. So like I said, I'm going to take apart this line. I think I tested it once before. This is the vacuum line, just to make sure there's nothing there. As I said, I sprayed cleaner, brake cleaner, all around the base of the carb, like I sprayed it on really heavy, and there's no real change there. So it could just be a very small leak that's causing that, not a very big one at all. Timing's right on. It's actually just a slightly advanced. It's supposed to be like 5 or 6 degrees. I think I'm in like 8 or 10 or something like that, but not far off. So a bit of a puzzle. And like I said, all the way down the top of the intake manifold, I didn't have anything there. So, oh yeah, and I also checked the vacuum booster. So just in case you think that might be the issue, I checked that as well. So it's not the problem. It worked perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. And I got to get back all the way back in. And the transmission vacuum line and the timing gear. Now, I don't mind pulling off the... I don't mind taking off the front of the motor, because frankly I'd want to put a mechanical fuel pump back off. The eccentric was worn out. I couldn't get one at the time. I've got one now. So I'd rather have a mechanical fuel pump back on anyways. So might be heading that way. I was really expecting to see some difference or some amount of pressure, but zero, no real pressurization. It could also be a sign that the motor's still pretty tight. It's also cold, so it might be best to repeat this when it's warm as well. So I want to summarize where we are. Before I begin that though, I just tested some of the other vacuum takeoffs on the intake manifold. So there's one that goes to the transmission that regulates the shift, the shift point, and then to the vacuum advance, and both were fine. So what we've got is low vacuum, around 12, 13 inches of mercury. I think it's inches of mercury. We've got a lean condition showing on several spark plugs. They're white, and the exhaust valves are white, so you can see lean, and that certainly explains the a little bit of lack of power and the stalling in the rough idle. The second thing we've got is there's no apparent, now mind you the car is cold, but there's no apparent crankcase pressure, so no blow-by. So what do those things kind of point to? It looks like a vacuum leak. It looks like a vacuum leak. So it's not external to the motor, because I've put a solvent, or quick start really, around the top of the manifold, base of the carburetor. There's nothing there, so it's not leaking. So that means that it's internal, likely internal, and that makes sense. That's why I'm not seeing any blow-by. Now again, the car's only got about 45,000 miles on it. It's possible it's tight, and I didn't run it up to speed, but the lean condition, the low vacuum, plus not making any pressure, all those things are all pointing to the fact it's got a bit of a vacuum leak, sucking extra air that's not going through the carburetor, and it's leaning things out. So what's the solution? And I don't exactly know what that could be. Could be a gasket that wasn't tightly sealed. Certainly possible. I did use, if you went back, I think, to the video where I did some work on this motor, I did use a fair bit of silicone on the around at least the water passages, but I think around the intakes. But maybe it wasn't properly aligned, or maybe there was the intake manifold and the heads, because they were machined, the alignment's not right. So, the solution to that is pretty inexpensive, a little bit of labor, but drain the coolant, pop off the intake, and take a look into inspections of the gaskets. Other thing I can do is swap the carburetor, which I'll likely do, but I'm not very confident that's going to be the problem. And the one thing I'm going to also play with a little bit, so if we assume it's a vacuum leak, a more expensive, less effective Band-Aid is I got a Wagner adjustable PCV valve. I think I'm going to play with that a little bit until I can clean up some of the projects in the garage and get around to pulling the intake manifold. But I want to play with that because that's kind of cool. I'm going to put a link up in the video there for some information on it. I'm not sponsored, by the way, but it's an adjustable PVC. So basically two metering valves, and it regulates the amount of low-speed airflow through the PCV valve and airflow cruise. It's kind of cool. Most cars don't, of course, don't need that because they're all set up with a factory, but it's kind of cool to be able to adjust or tune to changes to the motor, like a camshaft with a little bit more lift is going to have less vacuum. So you get to tune the amount of airflow through the crankcase to your carb. So I'm going to play with that because I got nothing to lose, and of course, I'm curious how these things work. But we'll eventually have to pull the intake manifold off and figure out why. Maybe even it's cracked. I may have to do some brazing, but do some inspections and dig that further, or dig into that further. So that's all I'm going to do for this video. I'll put up another one where we start getting into the both the Wagner adjustable PCV valve and intake manifold removal. So again, thanks for watching, and again, keep an eye out. I know I'm not getting these videos out very often, but keep an eye out for the next one, and you'll certainly know about it if you hit the subscribe button. Thanks, everyone.